So first things first, let's talk about card sizes. We typically stick with 3 main card sizes, and we offer a lot of product in these 3 sizes. So up first, probably our most popular is our A2 sized card. When we say A2, we mean that the entire card base is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches in length. That can be both portrait and landscape. And that is what we mean when we say an A2 sized card base or card panel. Now, when you're doing a panel, a lot of times it will be just 1/4 of an inch smaller on each side so that it will mat within an A2 sized card base. Now, some of our dies go edge to edge and some do mat within. And so what I'm going to mention when I talk about all card bases and also specific product pertaining to these card bases is be sure to look at the product description in our online shop, because we always list the product dimensions, especially on dies. So another card size that we use a lot is mini slimline, and we do have quite a few products for mini slimline. Now we base our mini slimline on 3 1/4 by 6 1/4 inch card bases. So most of our mini slimline will mat within that 3 1/4 by 6 1/4 inch size. Keep in mind, if we have nested some elements, there will be some smaller pieces, which also will coordinate with a 3 by 6 inch mini slimline. So keep that in mind as well. And then finally, we're big fans of slimline size cards. Now, we base all of our slimline product on the technical correct slimline size, which is 3 5/8 by 8 5/8 inches. Now this mats perfectly within a 4 by 9 size card. You can also make your card size this 3 5/8 by 8 5/8. Also keep in mind that we do have some slimline sets where there is nested product. So when you get to the little bit of the smaller nested product, that will fit perfectly in a 3 1/2 by 8 1/2 inch slimline card. So there are quite a few options for sizing within our dies, but this is the main card sizes and card shapes and card types that we use at Pinkfresh Studio. Now let's go over some heat embossing basics. These are the items that you would need in order to be able to heat emboss. So one of the most important things is your anti-static powder tool. There are lots of these out on the industry. I just have a really basic one that is this little pouch that has the powder tool. And when you use this, you just rub it on whatever paper you're going to heat emboss to before you stamp it. What this does is this helps the embossing powder only stick to the embossing ink and not to the paper surrounding it where you don't want to heat set it. You then also need some type of slow drying embossing ink. I have the Wow embossing pad. You can also use Versamark, and there are a lot of other embossing inks out there. Make sure that you keep your embossing pad, whichever ink you're using, nice and juicy. This will ensure that you get good stamping impression with 1 or 2 stamps using your stamping platform. You'll need embossing powders. There are tons of brands out there. You can use whatever you have on hand, whatever is your preferred. We really, of course, love gold embossing powder. A white embossing powder is also always a staple, but there are tons of options out there, so pick which ones work best for you. Keep in mind, after time, embossing powders, as they get older, may not perform as well as they once did. So definitely keep that in mind, and if you are struggling getting good results with your embossing powder, maybe check to see how long you've had it. This is optional, but I like to have a little tiny brush. This is just a makeup brush that I never used for makeup, to wipe away any little tidbits of embossing powder that maybe did stick to your cardstock. The anti-static powder tool really helps that not happen, but of course on occasion there are little flecks of embossing powder here and there, and this gives you a really controlled way to remove those little flecks of embossing powder so they don't heat set to your image. And then finally, you need some type of heat tool. Mine is the WOW dual heat gun, but you can use any that are out there on the market. Now, these items are what you need to be successful with heat embossing. We do offer some fairly solid stamp sets that we want to show you what we have found to be some best practices for seasoning those stamps and getting them ready to ink up and stamp in your stamping platform. So this is a relatively solid sentiment set, and as you can see, quite a few of these sentiments are on one stamp. So one thing I'm going to mention first before we get into seasoning, as I am pulling this stamp away from the acetate for the very first time, I am focusing more on pulling the acetate away from the stamp rather than vice versa. And the reason being for that is just to make sure that I don't stretch this stamp in any way, because with it being one piece, it also has a one piece die. And so I want to avoid any type of stretching. So I've got my stamp off, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set it in my stamping platform, and I'm going to go ahead and grab it with the window. The very first thing that I'm going to do is I am going to wipe the stamp down with a damp cloth just to get any possible manufacturing residue that might have been left behind off of it. Now, what I have found works best for me when it comes to seasoning a stamp is just taking a standard pink eraser and rubbing it over top of that solid stamped image. Now, you don't have to do this for all stamped images. Ones that have maybe daintier lines or something like that, this step is probably not necessary. But when you have these more solid images, by removing that shiny finish that happens, in the manufacturing process, and basically prepping and getting the stamp ready to take the ink, you're going to have better results when you season it. Now, you can do this step a couple of times, and I like to just wipe it down in between each time, getting any little pink eraser residue off the stamp that might have been left behind. Now, some people also like to just take their hand and use the oils of their hand to get that shiny luster off of it and get the stamp prepped and ready to receive ink. My preferred method is with the eraser, but you certainly can do it whichever way you prefer, and that might work best for you. Now that our ink is properly seasoned, let's go ahead and stamp this more solid stamp with some premium dye ink from Pinkfresh Studio. I'm going to use Marigold today, but something I want to mention before we get to stamping is when you're stamping a nice big solid image like this, it is really important that your ink pads are properly juicy. So if they're too dry, if they don't have enough ink in them, they're not going to transfer well to your stamp, and then your results may end up being a tad splotchy. So always make sure that you have a proper ink level on your ink pad, and if it feels a little dry, make sure you go ahead and refill that. So I am going to take my marigold stamp, and I am going to make sure that I evenly get ink over every single word on this stamp set. You can pick your stamp pad up and take a look at your stamp to see where you might have missed some spots here and there. I always think that's important because, you know, as you tap your ink pad over top, it may not get every spot right away, especially on a big stamp like this. Now keep in mind, I'm just barely kissing the top of the surface. I am not pushing real hard. You don't want to get ink in the in-between of the words there. You really just want the ink to kiss the surface of the stamp. So we'll go ahead and now using our stamping platform, and I am going to use a nice stamp press tool to help me get good, even pressure on my stamped image. And let's take a look at our results. They actually look really, really good. But I am a light stamper by nature, which I think there are many people out there like me. So a second stamp layer typically always suits me best. Great thing about having these lovely stamping platforms in our crafting arsenals, we have the ability to go in and stamp it one more time. And to quote, in the words of Laura Basson, stamp it twice, make it nice. And typically that second time stamping really perfects the stamp, especially when you're stamping a really large set like this one. And in the end, it ended up perfect. Now that we have talked about quite a few different stamping basics, let's take a look at something that's a little bit more specific to Pinkfresh Studio, and that is our one-piece product suites. So a couple of years ago, we started combining stamps and hot foil plates and dies into one-piece sets so that they would coordinate a little bit more seamlessly and easily with the coordinating layering stencils that we were coming out with. Now, this set is a little bit different, where the stamps, the hot foil plate, and the layering stencils all technically work separately. These aren't intended to work together. And then all three of these items work with the one-piece die set. There's technically two dies. It is split up into the two one pieces that you see in both the stamp set, the coordinating hot foil set, and then also included in the stencils as well. You'll notice that they're broken up in sections on the stencils as well. So what you get when you use these products, so you can stamp them. So we stamped this together in an earlier segment. You can use the layering stencils to create the words, and they look a little bit like ribbons. And then of course you have the hot foil plate, which allows you to foil. And if you of course combine that with our solid hot foil plate, you get the 2-in-1 foiling, where you get the reverse foiling. Now, all four of these items will work with the one-piece die set. So, couple of tips about our one-piece dies. This is a rather large die. So, I'm going to go ahead and cut out the foiled sentiments just for an example. So this is a rather large die. So you want to take the time to line it up. This might take a little bit longer than if you were lining up each word individually, But the great thing about it is you take a little bit of extra time to line up the die, and you get every single word cut out just in one sweep through your die cut machine. So no more lining up multiple dies to cut things out. So one thing we like to mention about the dies is to make sure that you're taping them down nice and secure. Larger dies like this have more of a tendency to shift when you run them through your machine. So let's take a look. I'm going to run this through my die cut machine, which is off camera, real quick, and then we'll take a look and check out the results. So here we have all of the sentiments cut out in one nice swoop through our machine. Just getting them pulled out here. And then, once you stamp or stencil or foil the other panel, you have quite a few sentiments all ready to go. And of course, this die works with all of the other pieces as well, the stenciled and the stamped sentiments. So speaking of lining up dies, I have another little tip. If you happen to be using a stamp that is maybe a little bit more bendy, take this one. So this is a lovely floral frame stamp. We've cut out the center so that we could give you more sentiments on the stamp set, but that does make the stamp more bendy. It's a little bit less rigid. So the way that I make sure that I'm going to place this correctly on my cardstock is I go ahead and I grab the coordinating die, and then I place it into the die, and I just verify that it lines up with each edge. Now, I probably should have used a little bit bigger piece of cardstock for this, but this is, just for example purposes, so it's still going to work out. So you'll take a look at it and you'll notice that all of the edges of that stamp line up with the die. So go ahead and grab the stamp with your MISTI window or your stamping platform window, and then you can go ahead and remove the die, and you'll know that when you stamp it and go to use the layering stencils and then go to die cut, that it will all line up seamlessly. One thing that we like to mention when it comes to our 4x12 slimline sized stamps that we use for both slimline cards and also for our washi tape product suites is that sometimes the stamp does not fit in a standing stamping platform from top to bottom. So I want to give a couple of ways that you can try using our larger stamps in just a standard size stamping platform. So we are going to take one of these larger stamp sets. This is from one of our washi tape product suites. And one thing that you can always check is to see if it will fit at an angle in your stamping platform. Now this one does fit just barely, but it does fit in there at an angle, and then you'll just need to use a larger piece of cardstock to do your stamping and stenciling on. So that is always one option when it comes to using these larger stamp sets. Now I want to show you another option, still using a stamping platform, but just a little bit differently. So what you'll see I've done here is this is just a small travel mat, glass mat. And I have taped a MISTI stamping platform to it. Now, if you don't have a travel glass mat, that is perfectly fine. You can do this same technique and just tape your MISTI stamping platform down to whatever surface it is that you work on, whether it's a desk, a large glass mat, really anything. So essentially what we're doing is we are turning the window or the hinged lid into what we're going to stamp with. So you will line up and of course tape down your paper on the right hand side here of where whatever you have taped your stamping platform down to. And then you can go ahead and grab the window. And now you can use the lid for these larger size stamp, and they stamp down perfectly. And as long as you tape your paper into place on the right side where you're stamping to, you can also stamp multiple times to get a good impression. So those are two ways that we like to use our standard size stamping platforms for our larger sized stamps. Now let's go over just some ink blending basics. The first thing that we're going to look at is the tools that you need for ink blending. It's really quite basic. It's mostly a good quality smooth cardstock and some type of blending brush or tool. There are lots of blending brushes out there, so I'm going to just go over a few different ones. There are, of course, the foam blending brushes. There's the ones that are flat. This one happens to be domed. The foam tops can come off, so you can have different tops for each color. And this is always a good option. Now, of course, there are also blending brushes. There are lots of different brands out there. They really essentially do the same thing. You just load them up with ink and then blend them into your onto your paper or using a stencil. Now there's lots of different sizes of blending brushes. I typically like to have a little bit larger brush like these, but then it's also nice to have a small brush like one of these for really getting in and working on stencil layers that might have more detail, or if you're wanting to have a little bit more control and only adding a deeper color tone into a certain area of your stenciled image, these smaller brushes are extremely handy for that. Now, one of the most important things that we have found, especially when you're ink blending with dye ink, is the quality and the smoothness of your cardstock. We really love the Hammermill 100-pound smooth white cardstock. We also understand that at times it can be hard to find. So when you're looking for a white cardstock, we suggest finding one that has a really nice and smooth surface. If it's textured, if at all, even slightly textured, or if it feels more porous in nature, you may not get the best blending results. The great thing about this smooth, very smooth texture or surface of cardstock is that when you're using it with dye ink, there's less splotchiness. Because the property of dye ink is that it's actually trying to dye your paper. And so that is where sometimes the unevenness or what you might call splotchiness comes into nature. Now, dye ink always smooths out as it dries. But when you're initially ink blending, you might feel a little frustrated by it. So I want to mention the smooth cardstock is always a really great option. So let's go ahead. We're going to just do a quick ink blending sample. We're not going to do the whole thing, but this is the 100-pound smooth white cardstock. We are going to just use a nice background stencil just so I can show different ways that I ink blend. And we're going to use a nice deep color, Mermaid Cove. It's one of our darker shades of aqua, pardon me. And I'm just going to show you different ways that I ink blend that allows pressure. So you'll notice I am topping my brush off. I'm filling it up with ink, but I'm topping it off on my glass mat so I have a little bit more control when I ink blend. I always like to start ink blending with a little bit of a softer hand. I can always add ink, but I cannot take that ink away. So I like to blend with a softer hand when I start. You can always check ways to grip your brushes. This is probably my favorite way, either 2 fingers on each side or my thumb in the middle, depending on the amount of pressure that I want to get. And as you build, you can also do a nice ombre gradient by keeping it darker at the top and blending it out to be nice and soft. This is the great thing about ink blending with different types of brushes. They are perfect for bigger areas, for really putting a gradient in your set. Now I'm going to go ahead and grab my Aqua small brush that wasn't over in this little package, but then I'm going to show you how, by using this smaller brush with more concentrated area, you can really get in there and blend these details a little bit deeper. This is really nice, especially when you're using like floral stencils or anything like that, which I believe Heather is going to go over some more of that a little bit later in our basics video. I really just wanted to give you a basic overview of the tools and just a small demo of different ways to blend. And as you can see, I've gone from darker and down to a lighter gradient, all achievable with the items that I shared with you.
Okay, now that you've gotten a little bit of an overview of ink blending basics, let's talk a little bit about ink blending with detail black ink. Our detail black ink is a hybrid, so there's a couple little tricks to have successful results when you're ink blending with it. Since it is a hybrid ink, it takes a little bit of extra time to dry. I'm going to demonstrate that here on this first one. I'm a light stamper, so I like to use my stamp positioner and stamp multiple times. So I'm going to stamp this 2 times to make sure that I have a really crisp impression. What this also means, however, is that there's going to be plenty of that black ink on my image. So you have a couple of choices. First of all, you can allow it to dry for a really long time. That's going to depend on the humidity of where you live and some of that. Here I'm going to show you, I'm just going to do 1 layer of the stencil with the ink. And again, this is right after I've stamped it. It hasn't dried like I've shown you. So if this had dried overnight, perhaps it would have been fine. But especially with lighter ink colors, you're going to see that black, by doing it right away, I'm getting some smearing on there. It's not hugely noticeable, but it's keeping that pink from being a really bright, vibrant color. It's just smearing those lines a little bit. And the lighter your ink color, the more noticeable that's going to be. All right, let's repeat this again. I'm doing the same thing. I've stamped it twice, only this time I'm going to show you one of the other ways that you can do this and get good results. I've stamped in that detail black. Like I mentioned, it stays a little bit damp for longer, and I'm going to use some clear embossing powder on it. It's not strictly an embossing ink, but it does stay wet long enough that if you work quickly, you can throw some clear powder on there, and then you're going to get a beautiful black heat embossed image. I prefer using black ink and clear embossing powder. Black embossing powder is just kind of tricky to work with, and if you get any little specks off of where you're working, they're far more noticeable than any little clear grains that might be in a different spot than you want. Now I'm going to quickly just line up my stencil here using that exact same color of ink. And I'm going to blend over a little bit just to kind of show you how much better that works, how you keep that vibrant pink color. You're not going to have those lines running from the ink bleeding out and smearing, and you've got those nice crisp lines. The bonus is the heat embossing also gives you a beautiful little bit of depth around the ink blending because the ink kind of pools there. All right, now in addition to this method, there is another option. You're going to stamp in a softer ink. I'm using just a light gray ink. Make sure you're using a stamp positioner. Make sure you've lined up your paper in a specific spot. I'm using the bottom right corner there of my Misty. And I'm going to stamp in that light colored ink. Any of our dye inks are going to work for this. It doesn't even have to be a light color. You can even use a deeper color. But since they're dye inks and dye the paper, they're not going to sit on top the same way. They're not going to be as prone to that smearing effect. So now I'm going to lay that exact same stencil over. I'm going to ink blend again with that same pink ink. Now, when I do this, even if I'm using the dye ink, it won't specifically smear, but I do feel like the ink lays over the top and it does soften the effect. If you want more of a no-line look, that's great. You can keep that. But the beautiful thing is once we're done with that ink blending, as you can see there isn't any smearing of that gray, but the gray where it's ink blended over has gotten a bit more muted. So now I can put that right back into my stamp positioner here, and I'm going to line it up, make sure it's lined up in that same bottom right corner like I did before. And I'm going to pull out that detail black and I'm going to ink it up. And because everything's still positioned in the same spot, it's going to stamp over and give me perfect placement and a super nice crisp image over the top. While I'm using detail black for this, and I love this trick for this, even if you use a different color ink, it's also great to come back over and restamp in whatever the same ink you used. That's just going to give a little fresh, crisp look to your image after all of the ink blending. But there you can see you've got that great black detail, but you've still got those colors on there. So here we have a quick look at all of the different ways. There's that first one where you can see it's kind of muted and it's blurred a little and doesn't look great. We've got the heat embossed version. You can also just heat set your stamped image. That's another option without adding the embossing powder. Just the heat is going to dry it as well. I think the heat embossing adds another level. And then this is that two-step stamping with a softer ink or one of our dye inks, and then restamped in the stamp positioner with the ink blending. Those last two are going to give you the best results and make you have a successful ink blending over the detail black ink. All right, now let's talk a little bit more about ink blending. Many of our stamp and stencil sets can be used in different ways. You can use the stencils on their own or with the stamp set. So let's look at how they work when you're using them on their own. Most of them are designed for a certain size of cardstock. Generally, the standard size is an A2, and you can see you've got these corner alignment guides, and the stencil names are also numbered in order. This one is stencil 1, and those little corner alignment guides are going to line up on an A2 card panel, which, as we talked about earlier in this video, is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. That's a standard US card size. There are many different ways to attach your stencils. This is my favorite. Some people like to use a magnetic board, line them up in the corner of their MISTI, or attach the paper down to their blending surface and then tape the stencil down over the top. Use whatever works for you. I just attach some removable tape from the back of my A2 panel and then line up my stencil over the top and stick it down on that adhesive that's poking up. All right, I'm just going to quickly go through the blending of each of these layers. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit as I go through each one, but this is stencil 1, and you start with your light color and quickly wipe it off with a dry microfiber or lint-free cloth and just move through each layer of the stencil. Now, the way that they are ordered and listed are all stencil 1, stencil 2, stencil 3, and you just move through each one. Those are not hard and fast. You can mix up those orders. A lot of times I like to mix and do all of the flower layers and all of the greenery layers. The main advice I would pay attention to is that you use, like if you're doing the leaves, make sure you do the base layer and then the deeper layer over the top. Other than that, the sky's the limit. Mix them up how you want. But there's that image all stenciled without the stamp. Now, I have the same set and I've stamped and heat embossed the image. And here's where it's going to be different. Now that you're stamping the image and using the layering stencils with that, you're going to completely ignore those corner alignment guides. Those are going to not help you at all now. Now you want to line up that stencil to your stamped image. The back of your packaging has a great example, and you can refer to that if you're wondering where certain layers of the stencil line up on your image. Most of them are pretty clear and easy, and keep in mind that many of our designs are a little whimsical in nature, so they're not designed to perfectly match up, which gives you a little leeway for artistic expression and also takes some of that stress off of having to have it perfect. Some of them will go out of the lines a little, but as you go through and do them, you'll notice that it all comes together cohesively at the end when you finish getting all of those layers on. So we're using the exact same colors, and I think it's so fun how you get a completely different look depending on which way you do this. So there's the finished image with the stamp. And let's go back and look at the one that's stenciled without the stamp image. And then one final look, I've die cut them out with the coordinating die so you can see just the different beautiful effects you get by doing these the two different ways. Pinkfresh Studio is well known for our one-piece stamp and coordinating die sets, which are really great because then you get multiple sentiments or images all in one pass and one stamp. But some people might not necessarily prefer to do that, so we've got a couple different ways that you can make use of these stamps. First of all, I want to show you one trick with these big solid images like this. You really want to be careful not to stretch the stamp. So I tend to kind of hold my stamp down and peel that backing paper off, because even if that curls up and bends, it's going to straighten back out when I re-adhere it back to that stamp image. So we've got this full image, all of these sentiments, and let's say you just want one sentiment. You really don't want the whole thing. You just quickly want something for a card. So let's just pick one. We're going to put it on the Misty there. And then I'm going to just grab a scrap of paper that's big enough to fit the sentiment that I want. And you're going to kind of line it up where it fits behind that sentiment on the Misty or your stamp positioner. And then get some adhesive tape, something just to hold it in place depending on where it is. You can use the magnet if it's on the outside and your cardstock fits there. Because the one I chose is kind of the bottom left and not the most convenient location, I just made sure that I taped it in place well, made sure my mat was right where I wanted it, and I'm just going to focus on inking up that sentiment. Some of the surrounding ones might get a little ink on them as well, but it doesn't matter. It's just going to stamp on there, and when we die cut, that's going to go away. So I often like to stamp multiple times when I'm stamping with our black ink, so I'm going to go ahead and do that by taping that in place and making sure everything's where I want it. I can still do that and line everything up nicely. So there we go. Now I've got that finished sentiment, so I'm going to pull off the tape, pull it off my stamp positioner, set that off to the side, and now I've got that one sentiment. And even though the die is all in one piece, it doesn't matter. You can just line up the one that you want there, tape that in place, and die cut that single sentiment, even though those are all in one large piece. So I've taken that over to my die cut machine, cut that out. Now I can pull that off and you have your single sentiment that you wanted, perfectly stamped and die cut. And there you go. All right, now this other option might sound kind of scary, but if you prefer to use these sentiments and you really want them, you can cut them apart. We're going to do a little bit of stamp surgery. So I've got just some nice sharp detail scissors, and I'm going to just carefully go around each of the sentiments. I'm cutting from the back so I can really see where that stamp image is and cut nice and carefully. And I'm just going to do one at a time and cut them out. I'm going to skip ahead to where I have them all cut out and finished. And this step isn't strictly necessary, but one thing I do like to do if I cut them apart like this is kind of trim some of those extra pieces. Kind of smooth the edges, just kind of make it a little cleaner around. That's going to keep you from getting any excess ink on those that's going to stamp and mess up your sentiment when you're stamping, or your image, depending on which one you're using. All right, and then once we've moved through, I'm just going to skip ahead through doing that on all of them, but you can kind of see how now my excess around is a little more closely matched to my stamped sentiment. And let's give this one a test run on a little panel of white cardstock. Let's see, you wanted to stamp that sentiment right in the middle, which is why you cut them apart. I'm going to ink it up and do the same as I always do, stamp it 2 times. Plenty of that detail black ink on there. And again, using my stamp positioner so I can stamp a couple times. And you can see how you're going to get that sentiment perfectly lined up, nice and clean. Because we trimmed off the edges, you don't have any excess ink that's going to ruin your image. And there it is, right in the middle of that panel. Now, even once you cut them all apart like this, the same as the other, you can still grab that one piece die. You can stamp these on a smaller piece of paper, and you can still cut them out with that coordinating die, no matter where it is on the image. Granted, I wouldn't do it on this full panel like this because that's wasting a lot of cardstock, but if I had stamped that on a smaller scrap, then I can still easily die cut that as well. I hope this gives you just another look at some ways to use these larger one-piece stamps if that's not your preference on ways to use them. Intricate dies. They can be really tricky and give you some struggles when you're die cutting. So look at this. I've die cut this intricate and I haven't gotten a great cut, as you can tell. There's a lot of spots that haven't cut through. Most of what causes this is warped plates. You can see how they're bowed and bent. It doesn't even take a lot to make this big flat image with all of those intricate details a little harder to cut. So there's a couple different tricks that we can do to fix this. The first one is a metal shim. I'm using my manual die cut machine, but this will apply to any die cut machine you choose to use. All you do is add the metal shim into the sandwich where your manual suggests. On this one, it's putting it on top of the die with the cardstock underneath. And as you can see, it is cut through and I've gotten a much better result. There's still lots of the little pieces in there to poke out. You can use your fingers or a brush tool, as I'm using here, kind of from the back, and that'll get a lot of those little pieces out. We also have this, you can use that same brush tool to get them out of the die as well. We also have a brand new tool coming out, and it's got that great little poking end to it there. And this is going to work really well just to poke those little pieces out. So you can see, just kind of hold it in your hand there, use it to poke through. All those little bits will fall out on your desk and you can scrape them away and throw them away. I also discovered another trick to doing these that I'm really excited about. This is just a piece of a bubble mailer. We all probably have tons of those that we get frequently throughout the week. And what I'm going to do is I've trimmed it down to the size of my cover plate die, and I'm going to put that down, then my cardstock, then my die over the top of that. Again, this just use whatever sandwich your cutting machine comes with. Just put the bubble wrap under the cardstock, with the cardstock between the bubble wrap and the die. Now watch what happens when I peel that off. It's going to make lots of noise with the bubble wrap popping, but I can peel that die off and most of those little pieces even stay on that piece. So I only have a few little extra pieces to cut out, and I found this really gives me the best impression when I'm cutting an intricate die. So there's that one that didn't cut well, and one little tiny piece I missed, but a perfectly cut, intricate cover plate die. One thing we get asked a lot about is how to dry emboss with your hot foil plates. I've listed the sandwich on the screen for a Spellbinders Platinum 6. Essentially, it's going to be a little bit different for every machine, but we have kind of dialed in for the Spellbinders 6 and also for the Gemini Junior. I have that listed at the end of this video as well. But you're going to, for both of these, you're going to omit one of the cutting plates. You're going to want to use the embossing mat that came with your machine. You can see I've got my two base platforms on there without one of the clear cutting plates. I've put on my rubber embossing mat. I'm going to grab a sheet. This is 100-pound hammer mill cardstock with the hot foil plate, face down, cardstock on the mat, and then the hot foil plate over the top. And then one more piece of 100-pound hammer mill cardstock to use as a shim. This is just going to add that little additional pressure and play with your machine depending on what you're using or what you have. You might find that you need an extra shim or a one less shim, kind of see what works for you. But here is a look at that beautiful texture you get. And it's just one more way to stretch and use your supplies and get more use. As beautiful as the hot foil plates are foiled, it just gives you one more way to use them. Now, really quickly, I'm not going to actually do it, but here's a quick look at the sandwich that has been tested to use for the Gemini Junior. So you can feel free to try that on your machine. All right, cleaning is not as fun as stamping and playing, but it is an important part of crafting. So let's talk a little bit about cleaning. I have my dirty stamp image here. It has a detailed black ink on it. I tend to like to try and clean that off fairly quickly. The longer it sits on there, the more likely it might stain. I've listed on the screen there the recipe for a homemade stamp cleaner we like to use. You can look on Pinterest or on the web and find another homemade recipe if you prefer, or if you use a purchased stamp cleaner, the process is going to be very much the same. An optional touch is to use a soft bristle toothbrush to kind of clean and get into those nooks and crannies. So I like to spray the cleaner on and then kind of get around. The more intricate the stamp is, the more likely I am to do this step. Sometimes I just skip that and move straight to the next step, which is a damp lint-free cloth. I've sprayed a little bit of water on this. You can see it's been well used to clean my stamps. And now I can just clean off both the ink and the cleaner that was on there and my stamp is going to look nice and clean and ready to go. There might be a tiny bit of staining, but that's not going to affect the use of the stamp, and I know I'm not going to have any extra ink on there that's going to transfer to my next project. Now, stencils are another thing that we need to clean. You can see I have lots of ink left over on these. We like to use 70% isopropyl alcohol. We just keep it in a glass spray bottle. You can find these easily. And then you're also going to want a dry lint-free cloth to clean with. The rubbing alcohol does a really great job. You just spritz it on there, turn it around. It's also going to do a good job of cleaning your desk if you happen to have a glass mat there. But I like to spray on the harder ink colors, like the pinks and the reds. I tend to spray both sides of the stencil and just turn it back and forth, wiping it dry until it's clean. And you can really see the difference in how clean it makes it. Lighter colors, you might not have to spray as much, but some of those little nooks and crannies on the detailed stencils, I'll just put a little more on there if I need to. The bonus with the rubbing alcohol as opposed to like a damp cloth is it dries almost instantly, crystal clear. So this stencil's already, look at how clean it is, and it's already ready to go. I could move right on to my next project and not worry about any missing moisture that's gonna cause any problems. All right, and finally, how to clean your blending brushes. I don't wash them very often. I found they really don't need to be. I keep one blender for each ink color family, and I keep a dry lint-free cloth, and I just kind of rub it on there to get excess ink off. And you can see as you go along that it gets softer and cleaner the more you go along. Lighter brushes, I keep brushes for my lighter ink colors, and you'll notice I have much less transfer with those, so you really don't have to worry about those as much. Now, if you really want to clean them well and give them a spa day, a little bit of gentle hand dishwashing detergent, kind of just rinse them well, massage them in your hands. The important thing is make sure when you dry them that you dry them bristle side down on like a cloth to absorb the moisture. You don't want to let the water get up to where the glue is holding those bristles in, and make sure it doesn't cause any damage that way. And that's all it takes to have nice clean blending brushes.